Biographies are a genre of book that it took me a long time to grow into and to appreciate for what it is. It seems to me from afar that biographies are the narrative side of history emphasized. And so when I first started reading biographies, I thought, oh, that would be the easiest way in to a time in history is just to follow someone's life story. And what I soon discovered when I started off reading biographies is that there would be so much minutia and zooming in at a high resolution into someone's life that I felt like it was bogging down the narrative in so many ways. And I didn't care enough to keep going. And that was really hard for me for a while. And I thought, oh, I'm never going to enjoy biographies then. It's just always going to be something, a genre of books that just isn't for me. But then, of course, I began to read more actual history, more of the distant, abstracted, far away history, and discovered the way in which really good history books still carry that narrative and carry world building within it. And it became a matter of actual genuine curiosity about certain figures who were popping up in history. And then that became my motivation to give biographies another chance. And I've since learned the value in biographies, the value of slowing down in someone's life and really getting into the details in order to grasp the range of a person, the way that one person is not really just a multivariate series of pressures that weighs in on their life. What you discover about a person is how they push back on those pressures. And it's so much a reaction to one's environment that defines who someone is. And that could be the place for biographies to exist. But of course, that genre of biographies is really just a bubble wrapped around a whole range of writing styles and goals, authorial goals. And it's really a genre useful for a bookstore to sell books to you by organizing writing on a shelf. And it's not so much about what a biography actually is. Every biography is its own kind of layering of choices. And so I was tagged in the this or that tag. I was tagged by David Novak Reads Poetry, and the this or that tag was created by Ros and Elisabeth, and I will put all of their links to their YouTube channels in the description. And the purpose of the this or that tag is to get into that range within biographies and to think about what do we want out of a biography. And so I'm going to use each of the questions in that tag in order to think about what I have learned to value in a biography to maybe help you think about what you might prefer in a biography. And really, it's going to be an excuse for me to recommend a whole range of biography works, most of which I've read and then some of which I've at least heard a lot about. And it's just a way to talk about books with you. So I'm going to cover like over 20 books in this video while responding to questions about the specifics of what I prefer in any one biographical work. And there's one section of this video that I will probably cut out at some point, or maybe it's not even going to be in this video. If you are watching this right now and you're hearing me say this, then you're watching the version of the video where I didn't cut it out. And that's because there's a section that's going to get into a lot more personal information. This particular genre of biography happens to be one that has affected my life a great deal, and I'm going to discuss that at some point. But again, if you're watching this, then I guess you're the lucky early ones who are watching the version of this video where that hasn't been cut out. We'll see. The very first question of the this or that tag is big, fat, and detailed biographies or short and succinct biographies. Now, there's obviously a place for something being short and succinct. With conciseness comes a certain amount of authorial control on the part of the writer, wherein they can orchestrate the various details, the influx of details that they've already perused themselves, and they could attempt to create music out of it in one sense, create a melody out of what would otherwise have been a cacophony of noise. And in that melodious presentation of a lifetime, it can give a feel of a person that is perhaps more emotionally grounded than purely statistically grounded. And that is a different kind of feel of a person. And perhaps that's the more true feel, to just have the emotion and the feeling connection with someone. However, my preference for biographies, like my preference with most books, is to opt for the big, bulky, gigantic ones. And the reason for that is by the time I become interested in reading a biography, I really have already gotten a lot of the history surrounding that person. And at this point in time, I want to dive so much deeper into who they are. Because when you hear about a historical figure from afar, you hear a mere outline or sketch of who they are. And those outlines, those sketches can be often hyperbole, they can be exaggerated in various ways, and make it so that the person feels so much more in control of the momentum that surrounds them. And it intrigues me far more to have an author really dive deep into the moment to moment of their life, such that I can begin to get a sense of the ways in which things get out of their control, the ways in which their faults as an individual, their vices, become the addiction that drives them, the ways in which their fixations or overabundance of desire becomes this constant carrot on a stick, just propelling them forward, sometimes against any kind of greater rational will. The ways in which their families and their children, their compatriots, their influences surrounding them, the way all of these meld together to make someone whole out of the mold of the outline that we had originally been presented with. And that is what's interesting about these big, bulky biographies. So I'm going to show a few of the biggest, bulkiest biographies I have. This isn't my way of saying that these are the absolute best biographies. I'm going to show plenty of slim ones further down in the video. But the first one that I want to show is one that I purchased fairly recently, and that is called The Prophet, The Life of Leon Trotsky. Now, you'll see, if you look at this one, it's extremely long. It's 1,600 or so pages, and it is really 3 volumes that was written over the span of about 10 years. And what's interesting about this particular biography of Trotsky, and there's plenty of other biographies of Trotsky that you can read of various ideological bents, but what's most intriguing to me about this one is this is written by someone with a Marxist leaning, and that intrigues me because it is a framework of grasping history that attempts to look at the details of the materialist elements of someone's life and attempts to graft that onto some big, broad abstraction about the movement of history. And as much as I think a lot of that is wrong-headed in terms of its inference that it attempts to make, I find the attempt to fall back down onto ground of someone's life and to infer a lot of the abstract elements of their high-level thinking on that ground, I find that an interesting attempt just in terms of how to think through something, not necessarily in terms of the conclusions it reaches. The other thing that makes this book especially interesting to me is it seems to be written in a grandiloquent style. This really smooth, connective, every individual in the story is also broadly connected to these big waves of history surrounding him. And it feels a lot like literature in that way when you read little bits and pieces of this book. And I know that the author is trying to revitalize Trotsky against what he had felt was Stalinist propaganda. And that personal bias is interesting to me. One thing I want to talk about is bias in the nonfiction books that we read. I think if you were only going to read one book about any one subject, then bias is extremely important for you to pay attention to, because that one book is going to become the sole influence of your thinking on that subject. But if you plan to read many books on that subject, which I do plan to do, then bias just becomes another, perhaps more extreme extension along the edges of your understanding. And the more biased it is, the more the details that will arise to the top will be ones that you won't find in the other books. And I find that interesting. I don't care about how different someone thinks from me. I don't much care for how horrifying I find the moral outcome of their point of view. I know that a lot of people really care about that a lot, but it just doesn't affect me in that way. I just find it interesting that people can have such starkly different points of view than me. So when I hear about a book like this, a book trying to defend a figure like Leon Trotsky, who many could argue was part of one of the most destructive government regimes at the start, it seems to me that sitting with that point of view for an extensive period of time, of someone trying to defend a figure that many others would not want to defend, I think that's just psychologically fascinating. And so much of what I get out of reading books is that element of teasing out the psychology that is going to be less spoken of or less defensible to the public sphere. And I find that interesting. So this is one book that has that quality to it on top of just being fairly well written. So that is The Prophet, The Life of Leon Trotsky. And in line with that same period of time of World War II surrounding the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, we have a couple other really thick biographies. We have the biography of Stalin by, it's sliding now. We have the biography of Stalin by Stephen Kotkin. And then we have the 2-volume Hitler biography by Ian Kershaw. And I'll show some more zoomed in views of those books in maybe some B-roll. But the first thing I want to talk about is this Stephen Kotkin 2-volume biography. And what's interesting about this one is I had just finished reading a lot of Russian history. I read the Russian Revolution book by Orlando Feigs, A People's Tragedy, which I had reviewed on this channel. Prior to that, I had read the Romanovs, a big history of the royalty in early Russian history, and all of the Alexanders and all of the Nicholases and Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, all these major figures. And I had read Young Stalin by Simon Sebag Montefiore, which was much more of a narrative biography, just very focused on the kind of escapades of this criminal underground associated Stalin. And the next big book that I thought I would try to tackle would be this Kotkin one, which tries to take the narrative structure of a biography and branch it out to a lot more history and especially a lot more detail. What you find when you start reading the Stephen Kotkin Stalin is you find an author trying to prove his work, all of the behind the scenes, extensively studious hours that he had spent sifting through archives and trying to discover contradictions and challenging some of the otherwise received notions of this character of Stalin. You find someone really chewing on a lot of that information. And it is so extensive that this book and both volumes end up having hundreds of pages of notes in the back, all going into even more detail than what is already contained in the bigger book. And it just feels like a grand epic on this character of Stalin. And Stalin is someone who's already bigger than life in so many ways. There have been countless biographies of this figure, so much to disagree upon in regards to who this person is and what their place in history should be. But it's still interesting to me to just have someone like Stephen Kotkin come along and strive to be revisionist in certain ways, strive to avoid some of the general psychologizing that gets done. For instance, in the Young Stalin book, you have a lot of emphasis on Stalin's treatment as a child by his mom, Kiki, or his father, Besso. And in the Stephen Kotkin biography, you get a lot of those same details, but less inference born of it to suggest that, oh, this is how he is. This is why he became an evil person. This is the trauma that built up the nature of who he is. And it's far less deterministic in that sense. And you have someone who's an author who is considering far more the grander connections in terms of history that this character Stalin has, and the history that was around him, the cultural pressures surrounding him, and the ways in which the momentum of the moment wasn't entirely his. And yet Stephen Kotkin also has a lot of emphasis on the choices that did matter from him. Leo Tolstoy, in War and Peace, has a large segment where he talks about the smallness of these major figures in history and the ways that it can sometimes be overblown in our histories, how much importance these figures can have. And uh, it's interesting to me because, of course, I understand where that point of view comes from. I understand the idea of us not having chosen so many aspects of our character or who we are or the things that build up to the moment that we are. We don't get to choose what our society values. And so even if you're the greatest basketball player on the planet, you didn't choose to have basketball be something that matters to anyone. That's really outside of your control. In the same way that even if these political figures pop up and are great at all of these little individual things, they didn't choose the influences that led to that. They didn't choose their wants. They didn't choose their parents. They didn't choose the time in which they were born or the war itself, the individual soldiers on the ground and what they were capable of doing. They didn't get that degree of power. So there's plenty of ways to describe these major historical figures as far less important than they otherwise seem. However, it seems to me that even if someone is a product of all of the deterministic factors surrounding them, it doesn't change the degree of influence that a single personality type or inclination can bring, especially when that personality type is given a certain degree of power. And so if you think of someone like Donald Trump in America, there are statements that he could make or just aspects of his character that obviously affect history in a great deal of ways. And so you think of someone like Stalin and the kinds of bibliophile tendencies that he had, as well as the ways in which those bibliophile tendencies can lead to certain very restrictive ideological bounds of what is justified or morally useful. And it's that kind of point of view that can lead to all sorts of self-righteous destruction on large groups of people. And it's that balance that seems significant, whether we like it or not. It's just this aspect of individuals where even if you can point to all the ways in which they do not have power, there are still essential qualities that make it so that their influence matters and their place in history can still matter. So I like big, thick books like this because it allows you to make decisions for yourself about the details that mean something to you that seem like, okay, I get to discern some of the archival notes that this author is choosing to discern from, and I get to decide for myself what it means, and I get to think in detail. And of course, even any number of volumes isn't the same equivalent to all the many additional pages of data surrounding a person, but it's still a starting point, and it feels nice to just dive deep into a figure in history. And Stephen Calkins, he has 2 volumes already out, but he actually is going to have a 3rd volume to finish up Stalin's life. And it's really exciting to just have such a deep level of density on a figure in history be published and released nowadays, because sometimes it can feel like there's a certain softness to the books that make it in the mainstream. With a set of volumes like Ian Kershaw's Hitler, here we find an opportunity to try to understand how someone so grossly cartoonish and brutish as a figure like Hitler could come to power, and the ways in which they can justify to themselves so many of the atrocities that they commit. What's interesting to me about a figure like Hitler is there is a great deal of self-righteous victimhood at the center of their pursuits. And that is something that seems prone to repetition throughout history and throughout all of us, really. The ways in which we can see things from merely our limited point of view, or we can infer stories out of things that are purely self-motivated by what will make us feel best about ourselves. Like I know in the case of Hitler in Mein Kampf, he makes an argument that the reason Jews are the downfall of German civilization and the rest of the world is because Jews don't follow the natural order of things in terms of the fight for resources, specifically food resources, that each race was supposed to be competing over. And that from Hitler's point of view, it was supposed to be the case that all the races fight over these scarce food resources, and Jews with their ideas that cross the boundaries of countries. Within those ideas comes a breaking of that rule, of that natural order of things. And you can see how through that framing that someone like Hitler sets up, it creates this idea of anything that this other group does, in this case the Jews, anything that they do is suddenly a perpetration of a crime against nature itself. And so you are always the victim, no matter what you do against them. And that trick of framing yourself as a victim in order to actively victimize a whole nother group is a very simple trick that I think can be repeated again and again. And the thing that is scariest about it is it could be repeated with self-righteousness intact, with this notion of purity and of sin on the other side. And that is a very scary psychology that seems hugely infectious among humans. And it seems like by the very nature of us being social creatures, we also become fairly limited in our scope of whom we care for. And it is that limitation that makes it so that we are so tempted to have the moral high ground in spite of the utter cruelty that we can enact on the basis of that moral high ground. And so reading about these horrifying figures like Hitler or Stalin or Mao or whomever, it just feeds into just a little bit more of that understanding of how we can do so much harm against each other while thinking that we are doing right. And that is something that always has interested me. Another brief mention of a lengthy biography, a biography that fits in the bulky category of biographies, would be the 6-volume biography of Abraham Lincoln by the poet Carl Sandburg. And I only bring up that biography because I find the idea of a poet dedicating himself to such a romanticized figure to be a kind of a beautiful one. The idea that a poet can see the lilt in language and the ways in which that music can carry so much of the extent of reach of one's words, and the ways that Abraham Lincoln in so many ways had the mind of a poet in his speeches and the ability to latch onto the emotional side of his audience in order to rally them in an otherwise discordant time. And with someone like Carl Sandburg, who as a poet, I have the complete poems of Carl Sandburg here. As a poet, I actually find Carl Sandburg somewhat limited, but a lot of the ways in which he's limited is in his kind of adherence to grittiness, and in the process it loses somewhat of his flow. He seems to strive to be like a Walt Whitman style poet with these elongated free verse lines that pick apart all of the details in the visual sphere surrounding the horizon of his sight. And that can be all well and good, but in his case, he seems to adhere so much to the details that he can lose some of the harmony that can take place amidst an otherwise overabundance of color that can surround you. I just like the idea of a biography being oriented around beauty, perhaps even more than accuracy. I like the idea of a poet seeing in a major historical figure a kind of sentimental fixation, and then letting that ride for a while. And across 6 volumes, that seems like a passion project. And the more passion oriented around a project, even the more pretentiousness that surrounds a project, the more curious I become. And so those 6 volumes of Abraham Lincoln, which if anyone has those volumes, let me know how they are. I haven't found them at a reasonable price yet, but they certainly are a curiosity for me. So I just want to throw it out as one example of a bulky biography that might interest people. And that's the Abraham Lincoln biography by the poet Carl Sandburg. Now we have question number 2, which is, do you prefer celebrity memoirs or average Joe memoirs? That question for me is a bit distant. I haven't read a lot of celebrity memoirs. I don't think I find them particularly interesting. It seems to me that they would just be promotional material for the particular individual. And average Joe memoirs, I'm not sure quite what that means. It sounds like it's someone who didn't do anything particularly profound or significant in the world, and perhaps they're just relating their personal experience. Um, that doesn't sound interesting on its face. I think for me, the kind of biography that would grab my attention the most would be one that would take a celebrity like figure, someone who is seen as larger than life, and bring them down to ground, making their life all of the stumbling elements wherein they have to catch themselves and make up for those losses. That is far more interesting to me. There are a few books that do that, where they take these otherwise massively successful figures or influential figures and either makes them one small part of a broader group or one small part of a much bigger history. So I first want to show that type of biography, the one that is about taking the individual who otherwise seems completely far, far away, this shining star in the night sky, and makes them one single light amidst many, and almost drowns it out, such that you can see the ways in which the influence of all those around them have as much effect on their ideas as their own assertions and personal experience, and the ways in which personally a lot of these major figures have various faults, frailties, insecurities, and those dive in and out of what arises to the surface in their speech or in their philosophy. I have in mind 3 books on philosophers in particular. The first one is one that I read not too long ago. It's called Time of the Magicians, and you can see from that cover that it covers 4 philosophers, and it actually focuses in on a single decade in time from 1920 to 1927 or so, and it's trying to focus on the ways that the 4 philosophers, Martin Heidegger, Ernst Cassirer, Walter Benjamin, and Ludwig Wittgenstein, each had an overturning influence on philosophy in such a way that had a long tail. And it illustrates their philosophical point of view by discussing the various troubles that they had in their personal life. In the case of someone like Walter Benjamin, he was an aspiring academic who became a relentless failure and had to discover himself on a trip and amidst a love affair far away. We have Ernst Cassirer, someone who took his ideas very seriously, his ideas of the symbolism that interrelates and interacts in human life, the ways that the symbols that we use become methods of cutting up the world around us in order to best grasp it and understand it. And it talks about his eventual major debate against Martin Heidegger at Davos, wherein they go back and forth on their differing angles of perception of perceiving the world. Martin Heidegger was a phenomenologist, so he was a philosopher attempting to get to the root of experience, of what we can actually know at its very core. The whole idea of phenomenology is to essentially question everything. It's that same method that Rene Descartes tried to use, where he sat down in a chair and just tried not to presume anything. And then, of course, we know with Rene Descartes, he eventually began to presume a few things, especially in relation to God. But Martin Heidegger goes back and does that same step of thinking, what is the essence of being, or what he calls Dyson, and what is the essence of time and our relationship to living in the world. And in the case of Ludwig Wittgenstein, we have almost an over-the-top figure, a fairly overconfident and seemingly self-asserted superior philosopher who viewed philosophy as a kind of language game that needed to be brought down to size such that we don't allow the language of philosophy to confuse us. And what's nice is this book goes through each of these figures. It focuses on their biographical background and the various experiences they have in their lives in order to just use that as a jumping off point to explain their various differing philosophies. With Ludwig Wittgenstein in particular, that character is someone who seemingly had some kind of personal deep constraint in his thinking a kind of temper, an inability to control himself or to resist the temptation to perhaps overly aggressively assert his various ideas. He was trying to break things down in a lot of ways in philosophy. And the next book illustrates that really nicely. And that's Wittgenstein's Poker, which is a dual biography of Ludwig Wittgenstein and Karl Popper, a dual biography that focuses in on a single interaction between these two philosophers, wherein they went head to head on a debate over what sorts of questions can philosophy rightfully attend to. And Karl Popper takes the position of there being genuine, vital philosophical questions, and Wittgenstein takes the position that many of these philosophical questions are really tricks of language, where we have not realized the ways in which the language itself can make us feel as if we are talking about something substantive, when in point of fact we are only merely talking about the relation between the use of these symbols in life. And what's nice about the Wittgenstein's Poker book is it focuses on that single interaction, that single night, which, as far as I remember, it was only like 10 minutes that these two philosophers actually went head to head. And it escalated substantially to the point that, according to Karl Popper, Wittgenstein brought out a poker used to brim a fireplace, and he brandished it at Karl Popper in a threatening way. And what's interesting about the book is it ends up covering all of the witnesses who were there and the ways that, even though everyone is there looking at the same moment in time, there is such a range of different interpretations of what was happening. And it's such an excellent illustration of how much the prior perception of things can affect our current perception of things, the ways that we can divide up a single experience in a wide array of ways, and how dividing it up can cause everyone in that one room to experience the same moment in time completely differently. And it's a great illustration of one of the challenges that all biographies have to deal with, which is facts do not merely interpret themselves. And so much of what we rely upon in a biography or a history is reliant on loose observations and memory. And there is so much about that in being untestable ends up being somewhat unreliable. And it could be really difficult to know what happened even in a single 10 minutes of time. And this little tiny book is really devoted to those 10 minutes, but it also at the same time, I think, does an excellent job summarizing both the philosophy of Karl Popper and Ludwig Wittgenstein. And I read this book back to back with The Time of the Magicians one. So I got to have a nice comparison between the two. I would say that Wittgenstein's Poker is a far easier way into these philosophies. However, The Time of the Magicians gives a lot more of the contextual time and place for these figures in the ways in which where they lived or the events of their time. This is post World War I and going into World War II. The ways in which those can have such a strong pressure on their lives and ultimately their philosophy. One more book I want to bring up is what's called The Existentialist Cafe, and I'll just put an image of the book on screen. This one I haven't read yet, but my understanding is it also balances out these various existentialist philosophers. And for anyone who doesn't know, the philosophy of existentialism is essentially existence precedes essence, which, to put it more simply, means you are not the essential qualities that you display of yourself. You can change those qualities at any time. There is a kind of self-assertion that you can utilize that pushes you beyond the constraints of whatever culture you're in. And it's really just a means of discovering that in yourself, that so much of what makes you you has been a tacit acceptance of the cultural constraints around you. And you can, at some point, declare yourself beyond that and push yourself out of those constraints, and not so much discover yourself as assert yourself and define yourself. And so there's so many existentialists in this time There's Albert Camus and Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, and it goes through many of these different existentialists and their arguments. I think Martin Heidegger is even considered an existentialist in this book. And I haven't read that one yet, but I hear it's a good way to give biography in balance with philosophy. And it's so nice to learn philosophy through the lives of the individuals. It kind of brings philosophy down from the towering heights that it otherwise can feel like it has, and it brings it to a space of humans just struggling through difficult problems. And so much of the contentiousness of those problems has to do with just how complicated the problems actually are. And so it's a nice way into that field of study. The next set of books that I think is relevant to this topic of celebrity memoirs versus average Joe memoirs is a book that takes major figures, or in some cases unknown figures, and brings them down into the context of their time and really uses them, the biography of these figures, to act as a simpler way in to what can otherwise feel like an overwhelming influx of information about a time period. It's a kind of softer form of historical storytelling that emphasizes the particular story of one person. And there seems to be a pattern of these sorts of books. Barbara Tuchman is one of the major historical writers who focuses on this. But these are three that I want to bring up. The first one is called A Distant Mirror, The Calamitous 14th Century. This is by Barbara Tuchman. And what's interesting about this is she's trying to talk about the 14th century by bringing us into one single French knight. And by following his life, he is supposed to be illustrative of many of the other lives in this time. And it allows us to go down to ground to see the ways that one person's life can be greatly affected by all of the harrowing events that were occurring during this particular period of time. This is the period of time with the Black Death, for instance. So by going down to ground with that one individual, it becomes a way to talk about the history of the 14th century while also really talking about the day-to-day life of someone in that time, and then using that as like a kernel that branches out to all of the other lives surrounding that person. And similarly, Barbara Tuchman does this again with Joseph Stilwell in Stilwell and the American Experience. And the purpose of this book is to, for an American audience, bring us into that feeling of being an outsider entering in to the world of China around the time of World War II, and to use that fact of this American citizen needing to learn about China and interact and engage with China. And what Stilwell learns becomes the things that we ourselves are learning. And it's that nice little technique of a single individual's perspective becomes our perspective into that time and place. So again, it's another softer way into history. And so that's Stilwell and the American Experience in China. And then one more book that does that same kind of thing, where it's using the biographical format in order to actually talk about history, is The Last Empress. And you can see the longer subtitle there. The Last Empress is following Madame Chiang Kai-shek, and it's really a way into discussing a lot of Chinese history before and after her. It's going into the ways in which China was starting to be pushed into the Western world on the back of all of these various revolutions in the early 20th century and or at the end of the 19th century. It again follows that Barbara Tuchman style of, in this case, following a major historical figure, and it uses that single character, her significance in foreign relations with the US, to illustrate and bring us into Chinese history, much like the Joseph Stilwell biography does. So in all three of these books, it's again using biography as a way into broader history. And it gives me this feeling of taking a celebrity-like figure and not quite bringing them fully down to ground, because they maintain their significance, but it helps us recognize their place within broader history. And that, to me, is a nice way to learn history and a biographical study of a figure at one and the same time. Question number 3 is complete correspondence or selected letters. Now, I haven't read a complete letter collection of any one writer before. I think there is somewhat of a risk with selected letters in that you have to really trust that the selector has your same priorities in mind in terms of what matters from the voice of one writer. However, complete correspondence is going to include so much of what can feel like waste, less significant moments in someone's life. And when you're trying to read and understand someone, there can be so much in those additional letters that really contains nothing of worth for you that's really going to add to your understanding. It's more going to be almost a distraction, in much the way that so many things that we write can be somewhat of a distraction. But, I haven't read a complete correspondence yet, so I'm not certain that that's what it would be like. It's possible for a complete correspondence to also allow you to understand the range of a person's being. Perhaps the selected letters would be the ones that stand out the most, and maybe they stand out precisely because the author wanted them to stand out. So then you're only getting one small facet of them, and that's that public-facing facet, the part of them that desires to be clever and profound. And maybe that's not the fullness of who they are. It's really just the version of themselves that is most refined. And, we can all have a refined version of ourselves, but that isn't really just ourselves. However, with all that in mind, one of the first books that came to my mind when I thought about selected letters versus complete correspondence is actually not a biography at all, but it felt like a biography when I read it. And I actually found that it was a great way to strive to understand this poor, tragic figure, and that is John Keats. And specifically what I read was John Keats' Poetry and Prose, and this is the Norton Critical edition of John Keats' Poetry and Prose. And the thing that makes this feel so much like a biography is, rather than having separate sections for his poetry and for his various letters and for his other writing, they weave in and out between the poems the chronological letters and, in some cases, reviews that were happening at the same time. And then you're getting that evolution of his writing alongside the evolution of his life. You're getting the love story that develops between him and Fanny Brawne, and the ways that that intimacy and craving of affection starts to propagate among his own writing, and the little pieces that he would share with his brother or with Fanny herself or with others, and how he was discovering himself so much along the journey of his writing, and also struggling so much as he attempted to make up for what he felt was a failure with his first large piece and tried to do another even bigger one that somehow would redeem him, and the unfortunate tragic end that he inevitably suffered of dying of tuberculosis, and the build up to that death. And it's all mixed together, the letters that he was writing and the poetry that he was writing. And it was such a fantastic way to get into John Keats. I hadn't read that much John Keats before I went through this little volume. And to me, I think if I had only read his poetry without grasping all of the life that was surrounding it, I don't think I would have appreciated it quite as much. I don't think I would have fallen in love with John Keats as much and really began to cherish his thoughts and his words and start to understand how much he valued the music in language. And I related to that so much, and it made me really want to slow down and read carefully and try to understand where he was coming from, and to see his various wants and insecurities mixed in to his verse. And that just made it all the more profound. And I really think this is an excellent way into John Keats's both life and his many, many works. And it makes the loss of him at such a young age all the more tragic. Selected letters doesn't mean that it's necessarily short. Selected letters can still be a huge chunk of someone's correspondence. And the one example that comes to my mind is the book John Steinbeck, A Life in Letters, where it selects his letters that he would write. And one thing that's interesting about John Steinbeck is he would choose to write a letter or something equivalent each day before he began writing his many great works, like Of Mice and Men or Grapes of Wrath or East of Eden. And it seems like letter writing to him was a way of easing in to the flow of writing. And so much of these letters feels like someone easing in to that creative styling. So it's not just letters like you would typically find in a collection where it is, personal correspondence and they're really just trying to impress the person they're writing to or engage with them. In this case, you really get this feeling of someone who's not just engaging with the person they're writing to, but trying to build themselves up into the mindset of being able to write what they need to write for that day. But it also includes many of the fixations that were rolling through the mind of the writer in preparing to write something for the day, and the ways that some of the challenges in writing rise to the top of their thinking and delves its way into the letters themselves. And so you get some of that struggle in writing in a lot of these pieces. And it becomes a way to understand John Steinbeck as a writer by understanding his own challenges in writing these great works. And that is a nice way to really grasp the work that goes into some of these pieces that end up feeling so profound and grand and majestic, like masterpieces, and the ways that it really takes work to do something like that. And so it's inspiring in that way to read a book where you feel an author doubting himself and trying to discover himself in the process of writing, but also aiming really high throughout. There's a kind of balance of confidence and insecurity at once with John Steinbeck's letters. He knew he wanted to write a great American novel, and he knew that the work that it would take for him to do so. And there's this feeling of having the bar really high in terms of what you're aspiring to, but also recognizing your own doubts along the way. And that's a really nice balance to have in a correspondence of a single author. Similarly, I also know that Virginia Woolf also wrote a lot about her writing in her own letters and diaries. And there's a few different collections of her work. Some are collections focused or selections focused on particularly the entries related to writing, and that would be in the book A Writer's Diary. There's also the selected Virginia Woolf diaries called A Moment's Liberty that was edited by the same person who had edited the full complete 5-volume set of Virginia Woolf's diaries. And that seems to me a pretty good expertise to understand what actually matters the most amidst those 5 volumes. Someone who had really devoted their time to editing all of that writing. It seems like they would have a good sense of what matters. So we have these two competing selected Virginia Woolf diaries, and I'm only mentioning these because my understanding is I saw a video by my BookTube newbie brother Brendan Booth Jones, and he did a video on Virginia Woolf, and he talked a lot about how much her diaries really illustrate so much of what she was thinking when writing her works. And Virginia Woolf being such an incredible writer, it seems to me like it would be a fascinating journey to go through those diary entries and just try to get a little bit of what she was thinking. I haven't read it yet, but I just want to throw it out there for anyone interested, anyone who happens to really like Virginia Woolf. My understanding is her diaries really add a lot to your understanding of what she was doing in so many of those works. And with her works being a stream of consciousness as they are, it can be nice sometimes to have some grounding for where that was coming from or what her fixations were at the time. So I just want to mention those briefly. Next, we have question number 4. And this question is asking, memoirs written when the events are fresh or memoirs written with hindsight? That's a really tough question. I think there's obviously value in both. With hindsight, we get the distance of being able to view ourselves almost as a completely different character and to judge accordingly. But memoirs written close to the event can also bring out so much of the raw reaction and struggle within that event. And that could be really useful in terms of a lesson for the reader, or at least a way into some honesty from the author, because the wound is so fresh in terms of what they're experiencing. And it takes away some of the distraction of trying to clean up what it is that you're talking about. And it could sometimes feel far more real and engaging in that sense. One example that comes to my mind, one example that stands out above so many of the other biographies that I've been bringing up so far, is this little tiny thing. I don't have a physical copy because I read it as an ebook, and that is the book Mortality by Christopher Hitchens. And most of you should know who Christopher Hitchens was. He was a major public intellectual. He did so many debates. He became quite popular, at least for me when I was young, because of his debates on atheism. He was a prominent atheist in that regard, but he was also just someone who was often contrarian and actively so. He would take so much of what is taken for granted in public discourse and challenge it and put it up against the wall. And it's that kind of challenging that really brings out the merits or not of so many arguments that can otherwise be asserted on the back of public sentiment and popularity. And he was someone who was willing to be unpopular in so many ways. And he developed throat cancer, and in reaction to that and all of the treatment that he had to go through, he wrote in an almost diaristic way, although still with so much of the wit and verve of a editorial writer. He wrote about his experiences fading away as a result of that cancer. And it's a tiny, slim little volume, but my memory of it was that it was one of the first volumes where I really saw someone speaking about death without the uncomfortable self-consciousness that sometimes death can bring. It was a very seemingly honest and non-pitying way of looking at death right on the edge of where you are. And the fact that he was an atheist makes it so that it's also a defense of how to die gracefully without the comfort of spirituality or the sense of an afterlife bringing you home in some way. And also the ways that dying is not beautiful always. Dying is not easy. There's so much about a cancer diagnosis, the range of ups and downs that one experiences. And with Christopher Hitchens in particular, he's such a polished figure that it was interesting to have a book by him that felt so much rougher and so much more like someone at the very edge of their rope. He has this line, I think it was in that book, about he was someone who always burned the candle at both ends, and with his drinking and with his smoking, and he knew that he was pushing himself too far and that eventually it was going to catch up with him, and the cancer caught up with him, and he dies probably sooner than he expected. And so the book is so small, but it's also this insight into that most personal of experiences, which is death itself, death and dying. And that's a great example of something being close, of an experience being right on the cusp of who you are. And in that case, an experience that we strive to avoid in our thinking, which is the inevitable death that we all have to experience at some point. Another book of closeness that comes to my mind is the book Joseph Anton by Salman Rushdie. And this is Salman Rushdie's slightly literary and experimental look at his experience of having a fatwa declared against him. And that is essentially a request to have him assassinated as a result of his book, The Satanic Verses, which was a controversial book because it presents the Prophet Muhammad as receiving a false prophecy. So it's a very controversial thing to write in even a fiction book. And Salman Rushdie suffered the consequences of that. And Joseph Anton is his book wherein he captures the 10 years of him in hiding as a result of that assassination attempt against him. and the ways that his life was completely overturned. And there was so much about the response to his work that was painful and confusing to him. And it talks about some of the ways that, he was just striving to be a writer, and yet suddenly he becomes this public figure known so much more for being the victim of an assassination attempt. And then, of course, if you know Salman Rushdie, you know that this has a more recent occurrence, and that is the actual direct attack on him using a knife. And he ended up losing one eye as a result of that attack, and that is way more recent. And he has an even more closely oriented book that is coming out that I don't own yet, and that is called Knife by Salman Rushdie. And that book looks at his experience, again, being known for being a victim in this regard, again, trying to deal with those in the world who do not value free speech in quite the same way that he or I would. And it's, again, very close to the pain. And it seems like a great way to talk about that kind of a subject, because it is something very confusing and very painful and very strange to deal with people who want to kill you for your artistry and your words. And I saw an interview with Salman Rushdie where he talked about how frustrating it is that he can't just be known for his words, that he has to release another book like Knife that captures the horror of being a target like that. And it's an unfortunate thing, because he is an immensely talented writer. I remember reading the Satanic Verses. It was actually the book I was reading when I met my partner. And he has so much poetic flow in his writing, and it's such a shame that we don't get to discuss that. Instead, we end up discussing how much of a victim he was in various regards. So those are two more examples of very close biographical-like works, in those cases, memoirs of experiences, of single experiences. And that's one of the benefits of closeness, is you get that single focus on a few moments as opposed to an entire lifetime. And then as far as a book, biography or memoir that relates to looking at yourself at a distance, one example that comes to my mind is a new book by Glenn Lowry called Late Admissions. And Glenn Lowry, if you don't know, is a conservative who, very much like Christopher Hitchens, goes against the grain of what you're expected to say. He is very unpopular sometimes in his opinions. He's very contrarian. He sometimes seems like he will resist the general zeitgeist on the basis solely of resisting, of just not wanting to follow along. And that is almost like a personal disposition that manifests in terms of his ideas, but maybe I'm not being charitable enough for his point of view. What's interesting to me about that book is Glenn Lowry is someone who, already being conservative, is someone on the back end of public opinion and not going to be viewed very positively. And yet he releases a book that is about all of the various failings along the way of his life, the ways in which he was very cruel to women, the ways in which he cheated on his spouses, the ways in which he was a drug addict and an alcoholic, and all of these problems in his life. And he seems to condense it down into a single slim volume. And I think those types of works, those works that are willing to throw shame at yourself and to reveal truths about yourself that are very difficult to admit, I think that kind of courage is necessary, whether you like the person or not. In fact, to me, it doesn't matter whether I like the person I'm reading about. So I really like that a book can just give me stuff that will make me uncomfortable, because it's real whether I like it or not. And I just want to understand people whose perhaps their lives are across a long chasm that is so wide that I can't even grasp what it would be like to be in that space. But that is, to me, what is so important about literature. And when someone uses a memoir to admit those difficult aspects of themselves, I think it puts out into the public something that should be understood about so many of us, which is that given certain backgrounds and certain experiences and certain elements of bad luck and even elements of inability to control your own dispositions, many of us would do horrible things too. And I think it's something to understand about ourselves, that so much of what makes it easy for us to be good is because we've had it easy to be good. And it is important to see the ways in which, had we grown up differently or had other challenges facing us, other temptations directly before us, easily accessible, that we might have done something very different. And so it's nice to have an author like Glenn Loury just release a book that is honest in that way about some of those challenges. And I'll talk more about why I have that point of view about so much of our moral character being a matter of luck in a later question, because I do think it's an important subject. But I haven't read Late Admissions yet. I only know about it because Steve Donahue discussed it in a couple of videos, and his review of it just sounded like exactly the kind of book I want to read. So I want to bring it up in this video. Okay, question number 5. Gossipy biographies or scholarly biographies? My answer to this question is it doesn't need to be mutually exclusive. I think with the ubiquity of correspondence at certain periods of time, the gossip becomes a necessary fact in someone's life, the ways in which it's not always going to be correspondence about the biggest decisions that affect public policy. Very often it's going to be relating to those around you, and it is a useful way to understand figures who can seem larger than life, to just grasp what sort of things do they mull over in their mind, what are the things that hold their attention in the midst of otherwise intensely grand and significant points in time, such as a major war. And one book that comes to mind that illustrates this perfectly, and this is one that I'm actually in the middle of reading right now, is Stalin, The Court of the Red Tsar by Simon Sebag Montefiore. And what is great about this book so far is it's going through the time period of collectivization of farms in the countryside of Russia. It's going through terror among the comrades of Joseph Stalin. It's going through World War II and all of the intense decisions that need to be made at that time, and also the inner turmoil that someone like Stalin had to go through. And it is great to have the gossip of the party itself, of all of the members of the party, and the vying for rising up in the hierarchy of influence within the Soviet party. And it illustrates so well the ways that millions and millions of people can be suffering around you, and that suffering can be played at a distance mentally in the mind of the person whose decisions actually lead directly to that suffering. There is so much insignificance in what Stalin and many of his comrades focus on, and it can feel in stark contrast to the significance of the suffering that was going on around him in the world, in Russia, based on his decisions. And it reminds me of the notion of desktop killers, of people who lead to the direct death of so many and the direct harm against so many, but because it is done on a sheet of paper, just signing off or checking a box, it can feel like just another statistic. And isn't that one of the quotes of Stalin, that, one life is a tragedy and millions is merely a statistic? I don't know if that's really a quote from him, but this book, Stalin in the Court of the Red Tsar, by focusing in on his court, on the people around him, it really makes you feel some of the banality of cruelty, to refer to Hannah Arendt's quote on that point, the ways in which you can do so much evil and it could just be another part of your day, just, a simple part of your day job. There's something sad but also immensely curious and intriguing about that distancing effect that we can have against people who are not like us, or people that we push into a certain grouping so that we can feel justified in harming them. And that biography, it's a really weird kind of biography, because so far it doesn't go through so many of the high points that you would expect a biography to focus on. It's actively focusing on the smaller moments, the little waves in someone's life, and all of the little fixations that people can have in their life. In this case, it seems like Simon Sebag Montefiore is plenty scholarly in this work, but the gossip is a necessary part of understanding what was going on at that time. Question number 6: Diaries of ordinary life or diaries of extraordinary events? Well, I think in order to grasp how extraordinary an event actually is for someone, it is useful to read their thinking on ordinary events so that we get that emotional contrast to really see what difference does that make in someone's point of view of what's going on in their life. But one other thing that comes to my mind when I think about this is if someone is writing about a truly extraordinary event, one that feels historical in the moment that it's happening, I wonder if there's a certain self-consciousness that might take over in their thinking and make them present it in such a way that they know that someone else in the future is going to read it. And so there is a kind of filtering out of their genuine reaction to focus on perhaps a more acceptable way of responding to some of these major events. For that reason, I think I might be more interested in diaries of everyday moments, because I really just want to see when the person is at their calmest, when they are at their most resigned and not quite as self-conscious about how they're presenting themselves. I wonder what self arises in those moments. One author who comes to mind that captures everyday moments in a way that stands out to me is Sylvia Plath and her journals. I have her complete journals as an ebook, and it's one of those books that I like to jump into every once in a while. Sylvia Plath is an inconsistent writer to me sometimes. I find her poetry so extraordinary, and then I read her book, The Bell Jar, and I craved so badly for that delicacy of language to show up more often in The Bell Jar, and The Bell Jar felt far more straightforward than I expected. But then I began reading Sylvia Plath's journals, and I felt like that creative energy and that just a pure desire for beauty was showing up far more consistently in those journals, even though it was intended to be personal. And I wonder if it has that same quality of John Steinbeck's letters, where it was Sylvia Plath's way of experimenting with words and getting into the styling of language. And I wonder if that was a big part of her thinking, because so much of how she writes about her life, even the most mundane aspects of life, contain just these little surprising gems in between otherwise more mundane detail. And it makes for, to me, and this, I hope it's not controversial to say, it just makes for a much more satisfying experience to read her journals versus her novel, The Bell Jar, and even some of her poetry. It just feels like the journals, by capturing her life, it satisfies for me that balance of beauty with reality. The next question is Arty memoirs or sporting memoirs? I don't quite know what this question is asking. I don't know if it's talking about the subject matter of the memoirs. In other words, a memoir that focuses on one's art versus sporting, the competition aspect. I don't know if I sound like a complete idiot. I really just don't know what this question means. I'm going to take it as arty in the sense of style. So would I prefer a memoir to be more stylistic and looser, less grounded in reality? And I think the answer to that question would be absolutely. I think there can still be an artistry to memoir. You inevitably are going to dramatize a life just by writing about it, because you are going to be distending and compressing time, whether you like it or not. You're going to be focusing on some details over another, whether you like it or not. You cannot give every single detail in a life, because then the time it would take to give all that would be another lifetime. So there's always going to be choice in that regard, and that becomes artistic choice. So I much prefer that an author embraces those artistic choices in order to deliver the feel of a life, the emotional significance of a life. I don't need every single little detail to grasp that. One example of an arty memoir that comes to mind, and this one is sort of the go-to, it's one you probably already know about, and that's Speak Memory by Vladimir Nabokov. And obviously he's a hugely famous and controversial Russian-American writer. And Speak Memory is him using his incredible deftness of prose writing that he utilizes in his literature and mapping that on to a lifetime to give this feeling of a novel in a memoir all the way through. And it's intensely beautiful and contemplative and relentless in its feel of honesty, balanced by its feel of poetry. And it's one of those examples of a really slim memoir that captures perfectly what a memoir can be in terms of pure beauty. And I imagine that because it is so beautiful in how it's written, that there must be a lot of licensing going on here in terms of not quite adhering to accuracy, but I don't really care, and I just appreciate the experience of reading it. Another more arty style of biography is actually biographies that do not fixate on an individual, but perhaps take a more unusual subject. And one that comes to mind is biographies of books themselves. If you're watching this video, you must be a literary fanatic like me. So you probably would appreciate just biographies of books. One that particularly stands out to me is The Most Dangerous Book. And this one is about that famously controversial and banned book Ulysses by James Joyce. And the thing that is so exceptional about this book is really just, it is written with a grandness of expectation. It feels like the kind of book that it's talking about the banning of Ulysses as an excuse to talk about James Joyce's struggles in life and the struggles in America at the time over censorship. And it's again, just like some of those other books I showed where it uses biography of an individual to give the context of the history of the time. This book feels like it's using the biography of the book and its struggle over being banned to illustrate the context of law at the time and public sentiment about censorship at the time. And it's a really nice way to get into James Joyce's life story by relating to one of the most significant books of James Joyce's career, perhaps the most significant, and one of those books that its influence ended up increasing all the more that its influence was attempted to be subdued and tamped down upon. And so that's really interesting to see a story of how trying to restrict language and literature actually boosts it up in a variety of ways and makes it even more attended to than it otherwise would have been. Next, we have question number 8. Gritty autobiographical writing or inspirational autobiographical writing? For me, they both go hand in hand. If someone has truly been challenged in life and tested, I think you actually learn so much more about who they are than someone who lives in comfort and relishes in ideals of themselves, because they really don't know themselves beyond those ideals. And when someone actually faces real personal strife and real failure in terms of who they are, actually learning through that failure the reality of who they are, I think that to me is far more inspiring, because the lessons they learned are ones that are grounded in what's there as opposed to what they hope for themselves. And one great example of a gritty biography would be this 2-volume set of biographies, which is the Confessions of Anthony Burgess. And if you know who Anthony Burgess is, he is the author of The Clockwork Orange and Earthly Powers, which is this really big epic book. What's interesting to me about his biography of his life is he is a well-known modernist-like writer. He seems very influenced by James Joyce. He actually has this great book called Rejoice, which is an analysis of all of Joyce's work, but that's a totally different aside. He's a writer who, in many ways, didn't have as much success as the work that he had put in. He released so many works, and he was always experimenting, and sometimes his experimentation gets a little bit messy. It doesn't quite work. It's not a popular style of writing. I tried to read his fictional biography of Shakespeare, his fictional telling of Shakespeare's life, and I found that far too messy to really enjoy. So he doesn't always strike as hot as he aspires to, but his memoir of his life is so much focused on, to put it bluntly, how horrible he can be in life, the ways in which he could mistreat the people around him, and the ways in which he had so many vices in his character and had to grow through those vices. And there's a kind of really raw honesty in his writing about himself. He really makes himself seem quite ugly and to me, it's the only aspects of life that really matter is when you can see yourself from afar and recognize the terror that you could have been or that you have been, and to recognize how close you are to that, and to see it for what it is, and to just have the courage to write about it. That is incredible to me. So I have to bring up The Confessions by Anthony Burgess. It would help to have read some of his works, but it's certainly not a requirement. It's an extremely well-written memoir, but you have to be comfortable with the immoral in writing. And if you want your literature to make you feel better, I don't think those 2 volumes will accomplish that for you, but it will give you a sense of another lifetime lived fully and relentlessly, and all the harms that that can bring. And there's a kind of realness to that, and that has value. Now, the next book I want to talk about, this is the part of the video that I might cut out later. So if you're watching this, I guess consider yourself lucky. You're in the early viewers where I haven't cut this out yet. And the reason I'm going to cut it out probably is it's a very personal example, but it would feel to me really strange not to bring it up because it fits in this category and it seems so necessary to understanding me and my life. And these are the 2 memoirs that my father wrote. And these memoirs, literally, the story in these memoirs and the effect that it's had on readers, and how widespread these memoirs have become to a certain demographic of people, the lessons that these memoirs have delivered for people, these really, truly have changed my life substantially for the better. I grew up, when I was little, my family and I were very poor. We used to live in a basement, and there was a lot of trouble in the neighborhood that we were in, and there was a lot about life that was really relentlessly discomforting and difficult to process. And when this first memoir that my father wrote, when he put it out, our lives went from one that was always on the edge of breaking down to one where suddenly we could have the comfort and the time and the space to reflect and to think about who we are, and to not be pushed down left and right by the individuals and institutions around us. And that first book that he wrote was Always Running, La Vida Loca, Gang Days in LA. And what you can tell from the title is this was a memoir of my dad growing up as a gang member, and a very destructive one at that. And the various hard lessons he had to learn, and the influences on his life that led to those lessons. And he wrote this book because my older brother at the time was also joining a gang, and it seemed like a cycle that was persisting, wherein my older brother was becoming just like my dad. And so he wanted to write about his life to illustrate all of the various failings in that lifestyle. And there's so much about being a gang member that is really hard for people to understand if they don't live in that space of being frightened all of the time, and feeling like if you do not rise up and preemptively strike, that you will become the victim of so much pain. And if you don't have that feeling, if you don't have that understanding of what that's like, it can be very hard to understand why you would group up with people in that way, and why you would assert yourself in such a destructive manner and overextend your destructiveness and embrace cruelty in that way. It can be really hard to understand. And my dad's book was his way of trying to communicate what that mindset was like. And it's of course a sickness. It's a kind of addiction and insecurity. It's of course a choice that is a choice in spite of the fact that it doesn't feel like one. It's one of those falling prey to pressures from those around you. But it's of course understandable if you allow yourself to grasp what it is really like to grow up that way, to feel like you don't have other options, or to literally have people tell you that you don't have other options. I remember, and I don't know if anyone would believe me, but I remember when I was in elementary school, my teachers would literally tell me that I will never go to college. They would literally say that to us so that we had our expectations tempered. I had a couple of teachers that used to have me face the wall during class for long stretches of time, where I would just be in a corner facing the wall and I couldn't learn anything because they thought I was such an idiot that I couldn't possibly fathom what was going on in the class, that I was just merely reckless, that I was lashing out for reasons of, pure lack of self-control and selfish desires in that regard. And they didn't quite take the time to understand what was going on in my life. And I only bring that up to say there's so much, when you grow up in a tough environment, there's so much about it that pushes you down to such an extent that joining a gang and becoming violent yourself really feels like the only way out, the only way to feel good about yourself. And these other additional options sound so distant and fantastical that they couldn't possibly be real. Any idea when I was young of actually doing better for myself and doing well in school was really one that feels absurd to even think about when everyone around you is falling prey to the weight of trauma and hopelessness. And my dad's book goes through that feeling of what it was like to grow up that way. And then he released his second book, It Calls You Back, about how even when he had escaped that gang member lifestyle, there was so much left over in terms of his grasp of the world and the ways in which he was not perceiving the world in a healthy manner, and all of the addictions that he had that fed into himself as a father. And that book, It Calls You Back, is really about being a father and trying to not repeat the mistakes of your youth for your own children, and trying to learn how to get out of those habits that feel so real. And it kind of connects to the existentialist philosophers we talked about before. There's this idea that the identity that you have doesn't have to be the identity that you have. And my dad's book, It Calls You Back, is all about how he strived to get out of that identity. And it could be so difficult to make yourself believe that you can be different than you have been. And there's so much about that is there's a lot of discouragement in the relentless failings that follows one's attempt to change themselves. And both of these books completely changed my life. And it's an example of the importance of a memoir to communicate personal experiences that can be very difficult for other people to understand, in order for them to grasp how lucky they are sometimes to not have had those choices in front of them. And yes, my dad made so many choices when he was growing up that were horrible decisions and can be shunned in so many ways. But having had the experience of being around him and my older brother, who did so many terrible things, I don't even want to say them because I think you would reach all sorts of conclusions about him that would be unfair. I think this is hard to talk about because I feel like it's really hard to communicate how much it doesn't feel like a choice to live that way when you're in it. And because my dad's books were so successful, I got to get out of that world and I got to grow up in a completely different space. And I got to be around people and hear them talk about people in poverty and what it would be like to be them. And there's such a distance between my memory of what it was like to grow up in that space and to have people around you be destructive, and what it's like when it's talked about by other people. It's just so different. And yeah, this is why, I don't know if this part of the video will stay here because I don't actually know how to communicate how different it is. My life now is so different, and the ease at which I can live a good life and I can be a good person, it is so much easier by the luxury of having financial stability versus what it was like before. And it could be so easy to judge from afar people who do horrible things on the basis of growing up in a horrible place, and you really don't know what it's like unless you've lived in it. And I have the luxury of being able to say that, oh, look, I grew up and, I did well in school and I got a decent career and I'm doing okay and I can articulate myself and all these different things. But I was so close to not being that kind of person. And I remember what I used to think. I used to think so much that I would be exactly like my older brother, and I would get into that lifestyle, that very destructive lifestyle. And I thought that was the trajectory for me. And it's so interesting when I got out of that world, how different it felt, those kinds of decisions. And yeah, this part of the video is just going to peter off. I really don't know what else to say about it. It's hard for people to understand on the outside. And I'm glad my dad wrote about his life in that way, because he is nothing like that now. He is nothing like the kind of person he wrote about. There is such a distance between himself as my dad, the literary father. He is so much what you imagine a literary father to be, and yet he had to actually grow out of a completely different version of himself. That to me is a kind of lifetime worth reading about. And so I'm glad to have that story save my life. Genuinely saved my life. Question number 9. Biographies of historical figures or biographies of contemporary figures. When I think of contemporary figures, people around right now, I think cynically of publicity, of it being a contracted work that was just written in order to bring to the limelight a certain figure and tell a story that's perhaps riveting and engaging and just makes us like the person more or think the person's more complicated than they otherwise seemed. And obviously that's a cynical way of viewing it, but that is what comes to mind when I think of contemporary figures. Is there's a certain restriction on access. You're not going to be able to go through the archives of their life quite as freely when they're still around. So for me, a historical biography has that benefit of distance. And one of the major benefits of distance is you also are able to criticize more openly. When someone is around, they have a strong influence on the zeitgeist conversation that's happening about them. And when they're gone, we can reflect as a public on their contribution and the ways in which perhaps they received more praise than they deserved, or perhaps the substance of their claims were more riding on the back of their style rather than the actual merit in their work. One example that comes to mind is there is a biography of Sigmund Freud called The Making of an Illusion, and I don't own the physical copy of that. I have it as an ebook. That one tries to go into all of the ways in which Sigmund Freud fudged his work or didn't quite do his research as rigorously as he presented himself, how so much of Freud's success seems to have to do with how good of a writer he was. And he really was a fantastic writer. He knows how to carry you along in a story. And the various abuses from Freud and the ways in which his fame somewhat preceded the merit of his claims, and especially the scientific quality of his claims. And a book like that seems to require that figure be out of the limelight, be out of the scene, such that you can criticize openly. And with the distance of time between Freud's life and influence, and of course he had a huge influence on the Western world, it is useful to take a critical eye to that and just try to reevaluate it. And I think distance in time is helpful for that. Now, of course, with that kind of distance also comes an inability for the subject of the biography to actually defend themselves. And perhaps there's various ways in which they could defend themselves that would make a difference, but of course we won't be able to know. To offer up a more balanced view of Freud, we have Freud biography, A Life for Our Times by Peter Gay. And this biography still criticizes Freud in a wide variety of ways, but you can tell that Peter Gay has a softer view of Freud, or at least sees the value in some of Freud's ideas, even if they can't always be defended wholesale in the rigidly scientific way that we would prefer. And instead, perhaps there's a usefulness to some of the concepts as just a kind of frame to look at things. And there is a complexity to Freud's character that Peter Gay seemed to appreciate. He doesn't quite condemn Freud as much as the other book I mentioned. It's far more like, here are the failings of Freud alongside his merits. And it lets you judge a little bit for yourself. Although, again, Peter Gay, he does seem ultimately to respect Freud beyond his failings. And so it's probably worthwhile to read both those biographies and more if you actually want to understand this figure who had an influence on the world. And I keep saying this phrase in many of my videos, whether you like it or not. And because that influence is there, you know, as an educated individual, as a knowledgeable individual, it's important to try and learn about these figures. Okay, now we're on to the last major question. This is number 10. Memoirs of happy days or memoirs of tragic days? I think my disposition personally is toward tragedy because I think you learn more about a person through how they deal with tragic situations. I've already brought that up earlier, but there's one particular author who comes to my mind. I've only read one of her works, and that is Night Falls Fast by Kay Redfield Jamison. And what's interesting about her is she's a clinical psychologist who has deep personal experience with manic depression, and she relates very much to what many of her patients would be going through. And she speaks honestly about the delusions that kind of rise in the midst of that mental illness and the ways in which it can deliver so much certainty in places where there should not be any, and the ways in which something as horrifying as suicide, as self-destructive as suicide, can seem like a rational choice. And she seems to have a lot of sympathy for that kind of choice. She seems to see it from afar as like a judgment in terms of how much pain it can cause in the circle of those who care about you. But she also is always keeping in mind empathy for those who go through it. Now, the book Night Falls Fast is her attempt to understand suicide through a lot of case studies of individuals and their thinking and the way that they explain for themselves that choice to attempt suicide. And the author is someone who has attempted it herself. And the book opens with the confusion that one can have when someone close to you does something like that. She brings up her own friend who had promised to tell her if he was ever going to be tempted in that direction. And in the moment when he actually committed suicide, he didn't tell her. And there was something very upending about that. And it was sort of a broken promise that was really painful for her. And there's this book that she wrote, and again, I haven't read it yet, but it's called An Unquiet Mind. And that, as far as I understand, is her memoir of her experience as a manic depressive. And again, she's a clinical psychologist, so she has all of this expertise around understanding that condition, but she brings in her personal experiences to help us understand what it is like. And it's that sympathy with those who are unsympathetic. You know, we distance ourselves from people with mental illness and we judge them so much because mental illness manifests as an agent making choices that are destructive. And anyone who does anything destructive, we moralize about them and put them in the box of the effects that they cause. And it doesn't matter your intentions. It doesn't matter your delusions. It's still you doing those things. And so we judge and we judge and we judge. And it's nice having someone like her who, whether it persuades you or not, or convinces you to care, she at least strives to give you some ground for understanding what it would be like. And perhaps it's a reminder of how lucky we are to have a mindset where those delusions aren't readily at play in our life, and how much of our judgment is a matter of our distance from that kind of mentality, and how much we are perhaps being unfair in our judgments and being cruel ourselves in the way that we distance ourselves from people who have those sorts of challenges. And maybe we should be a little bit more humble and appreciative of our luck and how much bad luck there is in someone who has those kinds of mental illnesses. And there's something really tragic, truly tragic about that. So I just want to bring up her work, An Unquiet Mind, and also to reference her work, Night Falls Fast, because Night Falls Fast, at least, is a really refreshingly concrete and raw look at suicidal ideation. And I think it's useful to put a lens on painful subjects like that so that we can be honest about it. And from my point of view, the more honesty in the world, the better. So that's the last substantive question. The only other question on this tag is number 11, which is to tag others. And I'm going to punt on this one and just say anyone who wants to respond to this tag, go ahead and do so. For me, it is just an excuse to talk about biographies that I enjoy, but I think it's an excuse that anyone can take up. So just enjoy yourself. If you're watching this video and you have your own booktube channel, if you haven't started a booktube channel, maybe start one and check out this tag and go ahead and answer these questions. All of the titles of the books that I talked about in this video will be in the description. So I know that some people complain that I put the books up too quickly. My thinking is I really just want to talk about the book, and I'm honestly not particularly camera savvy. Sorry that I put it up so quickly, but the titles, like I said, and the authors are going to be in the description. So you could just look at it yourself and look further into any of the things that I brought up. Anyway, I know this video is extra long. I didn't intend it to be as long as it is. I hope that you enjoyed it. If anyone reached this point in the video, you're incredible. So thank you. And if anyone has just been watching my videos for the first time, please like and please subscribe and all that kind of stuff. The support for this channel has been immensely gratifying, and I honestly don't know what to do with myself in regards to that. I'm trying to think about what people want to see and what people would value. It's really been very unexpected how quickly the channel has grown. So thank you, all of you, for watching. And if you made it again to this point, you're amazing. And thanks for watching again. Bye-bye.